Culture wars are still going strong in 2019, with those on the left and the right launching Twitter wars and sometimes physical altercations, literally. What's led to the rise in conflict? Author Douglas Murray argues in his latest book, some of the anger can be traced back to the weaponizations of identity as the older definition of religious and political ideologies are collapsing. Here to explain more on himself is Douglas Murray. He's the associate editor of the weekly British magazine The Spectator. Thank you so much for joining us, Douglas. We really appreciate it.
It's an enormous pleasure.
Absolutely. So, I've got the book here in front of me. You are also author of The Strange Death of Europe. Just talk a little bit about the thesis of the book. Why do you think it's important?
Well, I've noticed in recent years, like a lot of us have, that identity issues have been returning with a vengeance. This isn't to say that they ever completely went away, but I say on each of the issues I go at chapter by chapter in this book, gay, women, that is relations between the sexes, race and trans. It's almost like these issues all were drawing into the station of equality. And just as it seemed to be drawing in, suddenly got a head of steam, went shooting off down the tracks away into the distance, scattering bodies in its wake. And there's all sorts of ways you can see this. One is as perhaps an overcorrection of some kind, because nobody denies there's been racism, homophobia, sexism in the past. But all of these issues seem to be being lent on in our societies almost more than they can bear. And as I say, they've all become things that are being weaponized for what I identify as, in the madness of crowds, as purely political reasons. Not with everybody, but with some people.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues so I want to give you a chance to respond to some of your critics. The critic of this is, of course, that you're dismissing these important struggles of some of these identities that have been oppressed. And I think the way that I read your book is, no, these are totally legitimate concerns, but that the weaponization for political reality really erodes any ability to establish a civic discourse amongst peoples and move towards at least some sort of cohesive politics.
That's right. Everyone noticed it with things like speaking as a. There's already a problem in that. If everybody in a room isn't of a particular identity and they're talking about that identity, then it is legitimate that somebody who is of that identity might want to chip in. But there's been this strange thing in recent years whereby it's almost better in almost all circumstances to be of a particular identity group than to be of none. And the problem is that this brings our attention back to sexuality, gender, race, at the point at which, as I say, we sort of were hoping we'd got past that to get to Martin Luther King's dream of actually caring not about the color of someone's skin, for instance, but the content of their character. And as I show in the book, in the last decade in particular, we've exactly flipped that dream so that the content of someone's character is of almost no importance compared to their identity. Where, as I say, what is being said is in our societies becoming of ever less significance than the simple matter of who it is that is saying it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why this whole thing is starting to appear like it's breaking down very, very noisily. With one other reason, if I may say quickly, which is that people who follow the sort of identity politics, intersectionalist, very ugly word, but that's the one we've got to use, this sort of thinking, have been told and have been telling other people for years that all kinds of oppression all interlock. And if you could unlock one, you would unlock the others. And as I show in some merciless detail, actually, these identity groupings go significantly against each other in fascinating ways. And that's just one of the causes for the real grinding of the gears we hear in our societies.
I think you're right, Douglas. It's that those internal contradictions are just pushed aside, and this intersectionality really does ignore actually some of the class struggles within many of our societies. And what's so interesting I find about this is that you have diagnosed this problem from the UK, which means this is a trans-Western phenomenon. What is it about? So we're very different peoples, we're very different societies, but why do we share this obsession with identity politics on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, part of it is, the book is very much centered on the American experience as well. I've spent a lot of time all across America. And it's obviously America that's got a lot of this worst, which is why I spend so much time focusing on it. And a lot of the identity politics movements and grievances have indeed been ones that have spread from America to other English-speaking countries. It does seem that it's an English-speaking country's problem, not to say that other countries don't have it. But there are certain things like, for instance, the post-Me Too era, where other countries, for instance, France, went through this. There's the legitimate exposing of actual terrible behavior, including potentially criminal behavior. But for instance, at the height of the Me Too scandal, 100 French intellectuals, all women, actresses and others, some of whom are friends of mine, signed a joint letter saying this has gone too far. This is an overstretch, an overreach. The sexes still have to get on, for lots of reasons we don't need to go into, I trust.
Right.
But I don't think you could have found 3 prominent women in America or Britain at that point to have been bold enough to have stated that then, despite the fact that what they were saying was completely true. Right. So there's been a dampening down of a willingness to talk absolutely fair-minded truths in societies, particularly in America, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so Douglas, let's focus on what you talk about in the book, which how do you move past this? What is the logical, so is it to just let a lot of this play out and the internal contradictions erupt into civil war? I mean, what is the counter messaging, if you will, for somebody who would not that you want to defeat something, but that you want to move past it?
Yeah, there are several things. The first is, yes, the contradictions are very interesting. And as I show, for instance, trans, which is the one we hear most of now, despite being the most minority of a minority issue. Trans runs, as I demonstrate, very clearly against women, absolutely demonstrable and I think irrefutable at this stage. And it runs completely against gay. And now, you can't pretend that these things just interlock. They actually derange if you pretend that they interlock. So the first thing is you could just point to the contradictions. But that's not quite enough. A lot of the substructure of the bad thought that came from the American Academy in the 70s and 80s onwards is based in a form of Marxism, which doesn't mind contradictions. You and I might think, well, hang on, that's a great big contradiction. One of the things has got to give because it must be untrue. But the Marxists never did really think that. They just thought that contradictions were to be embraced and much more. So the key thing here is, particularly for young Americans in their teens and 20s, is not just to show that this isn't going to work, that it's a game that cannot be played because it's a game that cannot be won. So the bigger question then is, what ought we to be doing with our time? Right. And that's a real thing that towards the end of my book, as well as giving very practical ways out of this, thought ways out of this, thinking ways out of this, and behavioral ways out of this. My challenge, really, my request is that people realize the opportunity cost in our societies of our brightest and best spending the best years of their lives looking at their navels and telling everyone else what they find. What happens exactly at the end of this process? There's another form of this that I've discussed before with Jordan Peterson and others, which is this issue of basically harmlessness as being the great virtue. Just don't harm anyone. Don't go through your life without saying or doing anything at all harmful. And people are very rough actually to student-aged young Americans in particular. They call them snowflakes and so on. And I think this is deeply unfair. I think that if you look at the world we've created in the social media age, this incredibly retributive, vengeful, and unforgiving world, it's perfectly obvious that a young person might look at this and say, I just want to try to squeeze through this without having done anything wrong. And that's not how to live a great, successful, meaningful, loving life. Right. It's actually positively the opposite of it. So we need to encourage people to get out of it, because to get out of it will be to live a better life.
Well said, Douglas, and we so appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. And when you're in D.C., I hope to see you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Douglas. We'll have more Rising for you after this.